go. Morning, y'all. Nick here. What are you doing here? Coming out, nice rainy evening and night, so it's pretty wet around here. Definitely don't need to water out here. Which is always nice. It's nice to wake up and not have to water, because one, I don't like to use water because we pay for that water right now until I can get our rainwater catchment up. And two, because rainwater is way better for the plants than city water. If you're going to use city water, I recommend trying to get a filter to filter out all the chlorine that might be in your water, or the chloramine in your water. That's still on my to purchase list, so don't make it something that prevents you from actually starting a garden, but it's something to keep in mind. It's good to know. All right, how you doing? Cat's been pretty craving attention this morning. He wants his attention. All right, so I'm not supposed to take too long with this morning coffee time, and that's thanks to my brother-in-law, Chris. He thinks that when you start a job, you shouldn't be drinking coffee, you should be starting the job. So I hear you, Chris. I hear you, but so instead today I'm just gonna have my whole breakfast and sit here and talk to you guys. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm going to, actually today we're going to talk about the permaculture ethic of number 3, basically. It's called return of the surplus, or fair share, or redistribution of the surplus. It basically means taking whatever you don't need and whatever your system produces and returning it to the system. There's so many different ways to do that. We'll explore a couple of those in today's vlog. So let's get going, starting with the chickens and the cat, and then we'll move on to the rest of the garden. This one's for you, Chris. Ooh, what's this doing over here? All right, so one way I like to return the surplus is it's basically our surplus of food. A lot of times it's our scrap. It's a food that we don't want to eat, or maybe food that's just about to go bad, or food that we just don't want, excess food. So we share that, of course, with friends and family when we can meet with them, but during this age of lockdown and social distancing, we can't quite hang out with people as much. So I return all our food surplus to our chickens. And so this is melon I was actually having for breakfast. It's a cantaloupe, and it's on that edge of the cantaloupe eating where it's not quite bad, but it's not quite good. You know, it's like almost sour, but not quite sour. So I finish it, and I know Katie won't eat it. So I'm bringing it to them, and my mama, she's just walking around with it, and the rooster's following her like he wants some. I don't know why he doesn't just take some for himself, but that's the rooster for you. Here, bud, come here. Here, you want some? Come here. So here's the melon. Oh, no, she just takes it right from my hand. So that's one way we're returning the surplus here on our little backyard homestead. Keep going. There's lots in there. You can keep eating. Just stay from through the other mama, because she's laying an egg right now. Another thing we do with chicken specifically is we return most of the eggshells actually in here. So once we harvest the eggs from them, we crack them, use the actual eggs, and we take the eggshells, crush them up, just kind of squeeze them a little bit, even leave them in half little bits, and they actually add calcium to these guys' diets. And that calcium helps promote good egg production and good hard shells for the eggs. So they're nice and protected. It's not too thin. So we actually bring that right back into this system, and then on top of that, the calcium helps add the eggshells help add calcium to the compost that comes out of this chicken compost system, which is really good in heavy clay soils. if it's out of balance. It's actually the calcium-magnesium ratio in your clay soils that help determine whether or not you're going to have like a natural soil structure. Obviously, you also need the biology in the soil, but just alone with the minerals, if you have the right calcium to magnesium ratio, you're going to have a better draining soil. Could allow flocculation of the clay. Lots of big words there. You can check those out. Bud, you want some? So the rooster's very polite and likes to share the melon with his mamas. He doesn't really jump in. He lets them eat it. He brings it to them, make sure they have the food, and then he just kind of watches while they eat. So he's very much a gentleman. So I'm going to leave that there for them to eat out of. Another way we return the surplus is actually from the garden. So the excess growth from the garden, which also might be called weeds in many areas. A weed is just a plant in a place you don't want it. So there's no such thing as like a bad plant necessarily. It's just a plant growing where you don't really want it to be growing. That's what a weed is. So we return the surplus growth from our gardens, any weeds that we have growing in the garden, and we actually return them to the chickens. So the chickens then chow down and process those greens. Either they eat them or it gets mixed into the whole bedding mix, which then becomes compost. And then that compost, I return the surplus by taking that excess, or it's a product of our garden, it's a yield. That's one of the permaculture principles, but today we're talking about the ethics. So I actually return the surplus of compost, that surplus of organic material, microbes, and nutrients basically in that compost, and I return that to the garden. So weeds come out of the garden, and food scraps from the garden come out and go back into the chicken system. The chickens go through it and process it. We harvest eggs from the chicken and we return those eggshells to the chickens. That whole process basically keeps all the nutrients going into one flow. And at the bottom of this flow, we have the compost. And once that is complete and the compost is finished, that product is returned to the garden. So it goes from weeds to the chickens, goes from eggshells to the chickens weeds, the eggshells weeds, the chickens process, all that extra bulk organic material that we throw in there, they process, then we build into a compost pile. The compost pile builds and grows and the chickens get interested in it and eat all the insects and the little bugs and the seeds crawling through there. And we take that compost and we return it to the garden. So returning the surplus of organic material and the surplus of biology to the garden to promote more growth. So anytime you pull a weed or something away from the garden, this is all mineral nutrient and carbon from your garden. So if that came from your garden and you remove it, you have to replace it. It's about returning to the garden. It's redistributing all these supplies you have back into the garden. If you keep doing that, the garden will keep producing. It'll keep producing even if you have constant production. If you're returning to the garden, it'll keep producing for you. And that's a boon to anyone. This is kind of not really a return of the surplus, but I do have a surplus of feed bags once I finish using them. This one I'm using actually as a rain barrier for my lid here, because right where the handle joins the seams, there's small little holes. Now, I could put a little bit of silicone caulk in there and that'd be just fine, but I kind of like this. I just throw this right on top and it acts as a little rain barrier to keep any water from getting into my feed barrel. When I don't use them like that, I actually give them to our friend Dory, who lives just up the road, part of the year at least. And she actually turns these into handbags or bags for her to go shopping in, shopping bags. So really kind of cool reuse. Instead of just throwing it away and creating a waste material, we're actually trying to reuse those. We're redistributing that surplus. I mean, a surplus of feed bags is actually a thing, and that surplus could go into the landfill, or you can choose to try to do something with it. All right, so perhaps the biggest return of the surplus that we can do is returning the compost, is returning nutrient to the soil after we've harvested nutrient from the soil. So again, this is something to think about for anywhere in the world. If you're growing food from a soil and you then harvest that food, you're taking nutrient that was in this soil originally away from the system. If that nutrient, basically, if you allowed this stuff to grow and then it died and falled back here, that's automatically cycling. That's what happens in forests. So, in deciduous forests, that is. They grow, leaves grow, and in the fall, all that nutrient from the leaves falls onto the ground. That decomposes and feeds the soil. So that nutrient is returned automatically by nature. Nature knows what it's doing. It doesn't have to really think about this so much. We, on the other hand, like to try to take as much as we possibly can out of the garden in order to, fulfill our own needs. And that is okay. That's what a garden's for. But we need to be thinking about returning those nutrients and returning the surplus that we do have back to the garden. So we have a surplus of material in the form of compost, and that compost also has the benefits of organic matter, which helps the soil. Also has the benefit of all the microorganisms in the compost, which help the soil. I don't know if you see where I'm going here. I'm talking about supporting the soil. Yeah, you want the plants to grow. Plants are your goal, right? The goal of, you want to obtain a yield. That's another one of the permaculture principles we'll talk about in another video. But you always want to obtain some sort of yield from the system that you're managing, because otherwise, what's the point? What's the point? I mean, just building soil for building soil's sake, that's a very noble cause. That's great, and I absolutely would support that. But you need to kind of be invested in it somehow. So you want to get something back from this garden, not just you giving all you can to the garden. So that's obtaining a yield. We'll cover that in a different module, or a different video. But but focusing not on feeding the plant so much as feeding the soil, because it's the soil that feeds the plant. Let's say it again. It's the soil that feeds the plant. So you can think less about feeding the plant by adding, liquid fertilizers that you'd buy at a store, or really think, the NPK amounts in those fertilizers. That's not so important. In fact, it can actually hurt the soil if it's done too much, because most of those nutrients are in salt forms, and salt is toxic to plants. They don't want salt in their diets. They want. Ooh, I just pulled out a flower by accident. Whoops. It'll be all right. We don't want salt in the soil. Salts cause problems. You don't want a salty soil. It doesn't make sense. It's not what the plants want, not what the plants need. Salt can cause problems. If you've been around the growing area too long, you know that. So we're returning this surplus, which is compost I harvested yesterday from the chicken compost system here. And I'm going to return all these nutrients, and part of these nutrients were from the garden, weeds from the garden, from my land. When I do a big kind of cleanup day, I'll clean all along the fences, all the tall grass. I take all that and I put it into my chicken compost system. And that chicken compost system processes it all, but all of that nutrient that I took from around my property here needs to be replaced somehow. And I'm replacing it in the form of this compost to the beds. Now, I'm not going to put the compost, along the kind of viney growth that where I harvest it from, because I don't necessarily want to favor that. But I am putting them at the top of my property on this bed, and these nutrients will trickle down. They'll go all the way down to the bottom of the property. In the tropics here, there's just so much abundant growth just because of the climate here. We just have pretty much year-round perfect growing conditions, a little bit of, excess rain for most things, but Doesn't really bother most of the plants here, I've noticed. They're just fine with the growth. All right, so basically what I'm doing now is after I've gone through this bed here and I've weeded of the stuff I don't necessarily want. Again, what's a weed? A plant growing where you don't want it to. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's trying to fulfill a purpose there, and you're disallowing it to fulfill that purpose. And again, so I'm taking these weeds, this right here, this is nutrient and carbon from my soil. That's what makes this. Photosynthesis in the sun helps power that, but everything's coming from right here. So I want to make sure that if I'm taking away from this, then I'm going to give back to the soil. It's a very simple ethic, this permaculture ethic, return to the surplus, because it's just something it's simple, but it's not something that necessarily you'd think of unless it's in your head. It's something that used to be taught. It's something that used to be just known. This is like a very, very basic ethic that helps ground our permaculture practices. But this is something that was always known back in any native people. They knew, and that's kind of what permaculture does. Permaculture really tries to learn from the native communities in whatever region you're in, because they by far knew how to work with the land and help manage the land in a beneficial way more than any of us 21st century humans know, because they were so in tune with it for so long. They learn from experience, and you can learn from experience too. You can be just as wise, especially if you use the teachings of the native people of your region. If you just learn how they manage the land, just look it up. Look up, whatever your local tribes were, or whatever your local native peoples were. Look up how they manage the land. And there might be some ways that, it's going to be an okay way to manage land. There might be some improvements to be made just because, scientific breakthroughs and all that. But the reality is they manage the land without all that. They manage the land by observing and by seeing what the land needed and responding to it. And that's what we need to learn to do. That's something that's just not taught anymore. And it's something that's kind of sad it's not taught, because that's a very important thing to be mindful of as you manage land, is really how to manage the land without destroying it. And that's basically where these permaculture ethics came from. So the 3 ethics, if you're not familiar with them, let's go over the 3 ethics. The 3 ethics of permaculture are earth care, people care, and return to the surplus. Some people call that fair share, just to make it a little bit more rhyming, right? But it's basically the first one, and these go in order. So basically you take whatever's going on, you go in this order. Earth care. First thing you do, you have to care for the earth. If what you're doing is not beneficial for the earth in some way, the soil, the actions you're taking or anything like that, it's not beneficial for the earth, you shouldn't be doing it. Now, of course, there's going to be exceptions like, okay, well, this isn't burning fossil fuels isn't necessarily beneficial for the earth, but if you're burning those fossil fuels in a tractor to prep a plot of land that you're going to be using for perennial food production, that little bit of amount of burning fossil fuels over the lifetime of the project likely will outweigh the cost of the negatives of the fossil fuel burning. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind, especially when it comes to the kind of the fossil fuel argument, because that comes up a lot, especially in the permaculture world. The second ethic, people care. And that's kind of the difference between how permaculture systems and permaculture thinking manage this thing versus a conventional ways. We recognize that people, humans, are going to be involved in these systems. We recognize that. So instead of going, oh, well, humans are causing all the problems, humans are the root of all of our solutions, it's saying, well, yeah, so we've been doing some things wrong. We accept that, but with this framing of these ethics and the framing of the permaculture principles, we can fix them. We can say, okay, this land, I'm going to be living on this land. I know that. I'm going to be living here. So how can I help how can I help make it better? How can I help improve the land while I'm here? How can I help make this a better place? The permaculture design methodology is human-centric. It's about making sure people have the care that they need to thrive, not just to survive, but to thrive. And not just me and Katie, but everyone around us. Eventually, this small little backyard plot should be able to produce a lot of our own food, but there's going to be times where we just have so much food at once that we can't handle it all. So we can either store that in the form of preserves or various products, or we can share that. And again, that's the redistribution of the surplus. That's ethic number 3. If we have excess food, we share that food. We give it to our neighbors. We give it to our family up here. We allow them to be part of this harvest that we have here. We think about that as we design and implement and manage our systems. So back to the second one, the people care. It's a really important one, because you don't want to be doing anything on your property and in your design that is not beneficial for people. Yeah, you might have to make some sacrifices, right? You might not be able to get exactly what you want out of the situation, and that's okay. But it's about designing the system so that humans and you are kind of the center of that thought process. So, but in doing so, you don't supersede the first ethic of earth care. So you can't say, oh, well, I need all this stuff to live, so I'm going to do all this. If you're doing that plus harming the earth, that's a no-go in the permaculture mindset. All right, so I have applied a nice round of compost here. If you didn't see what I was doing the whole time, basically what I did is I did a bit of weeding. Again, what are weeds? Plants growing where you don't want them to grow. Not necessarily bad, just I don't really want all this grass in my garden bed, so I'm removing it. I'm going to take all that, and actually most of the time I just leave it in this footpath here, and then I walk on it and it gets destroyed, and slowly that builds up as mulch, and then I return that mulch right to the system. So there's another return of the surplus. Mulching is a really good one. Taking all that organic material that's falling. I have so much from these banana leaves right above me. All that surplus energy that originally came from the ground, returning that back in the form of mulch. Because all these organisms in the soil, they need to feed, and mulch is a really good way to feed them. It also protects them from harsh sunlight and harsh rains. So it's a really good way to return a surplus, is taking, especially in the fall and the temperate climates, all those leaves that people bag up, go find those leaves, take them for yourself and use them as mulch. You're basically feeding your property off of their trash. To me, that's crazy, but it can be a very beneficial thing for you if you act on it at the right time. So I'm returning this mulch to basically protect the soil, and I'm going to need more, and I already know that because when I started this process, I was thinking, oh, today I should add some more mulch to this garden after I compost it. So again, I'm returning the surplus here, surplus of energy through the compost we produced, and I kind of made that a nice big surplus of energy by managing the system. And that's what's nice about permaculture. It's not about just putting it out there and leaving it. A lot of people have that conception about permaculture. It's about lazy gardening, right? It's about setting up the system and then walking away and it's going to produce forever. The reality is, if you're not there to walk it through and to just help it along its way, it's like anything. If you started a business and you got it up and running, and then you're like, all right, cool, everything's running, I'm just going to walk away and just let my underlings handle it. There's probably going to be some things that slip through the cracks and don't quite stay the way you intended them. And that's what you're here for. Permaculture design it's a methodology that allows human-centric design, but that's it, it's human-centric. You, the human, needs to be part of the process. All right, guys, so just a quick little note of what's in this garden that I'm working in. I have a bunch of kale coming up. You can probably see that right in front of you here. There are little baby papaya trees. This was right here was where we put all of our compost when we first moved into this place. Any of our excess food scraps, any of those excess weeds, I just threw them all right underneath this banana clump because bananas love a lot of nutrient. So I took them, put them right here underneath this banana clump, and this slowly built up this soil nice and rich. So this is an area, and it's also protected by these bananas. So this right here is called New Zealand spinach. It's not actually a spinach, but it has a very similar taste and texture. And it's I've never grown it before, so I'm still learning its habits and everything. But so far, it seems to be doing really well right here. I'm really excited about it. This is supposed to be just like a kind of a scramble along the ground, and it'll kind of spread out over this whole bed and eventually be a perennial green for us. In the tropics, you really want to try to focus on perennials, because just the cycles of life here, it's so intense. It's constant production, it's constant pumping. So annuals, while they certainly serve a purpose, they often just can't keep up. They can't keep up on that kind of constant production cycle. And so trying to work into perennials in your system, especially in the tropics, but really anywhere, is a huge benefit to your system. So this will end up being a perennial green for us if it actually takes. And so far, it seems to be working great. I also have this kale just to be as a nice annual production that should last quite a long time. At first, it wasn't doing so well. I think it wasn't getting enough sun, but now that we're moving more towards summer and the sun angles are getting a little bit bigger, we're actually getting a little bit more production here, and I see they're really taking off. I suspect that this little return of surplus of compost and mulch is going to really be beneficial for them. So I have about half of this bed that I still need to cover up, and luckily I have all this Otto's always joining me on the garden for this kind of work. He likes to be a part of it. You see him wagging his tail anytime I talk about him. Good boy. He's looking at a bird in our trees over there who's making a ruckus, a little grackle. I don't know if you can see him. He's on this branch over here. Oh, he just flew away. He's been making a lot of ruckus, and I was very interested. So this is basically, that's the soil plus compost up there, and this is the soil plus compost plus mulch. You can see I still need to add more mulch. I did use the sugarcane here, that excess I had. I just needed to go harvest a little bit more from somewhere. I have definitely more sugarcane I can harvest. So much of it here. But that's pretty much the gist of it, guys. It's returning the surplus. It's taking material. Anytime you harvest material from your garden, you have to think about that as you're taking out from the bank. And in order to continue to have a nice savings account and a nice little stash of money in the bank, you need to return. You can't just withdraw. You need to return to the soil. And that's a really good kind of simple way of looking at it that might help some of you guys understand that ethic. So that's pretty much it for today. This little discussion of the permaculture ethics. And if you do return the surplus, you get to have the majesty of abundant growth. All of this is sweet potato. That'll be ready in another few months. Just when hurricane season is getting up and running. So this is kind of like a security for us. I mean, it's taking up a very large percentage of my small garden bed system here, but this should produce a lot of sweet potato in this small little bit of space. And with sweet potato, what's nice is all this excess that's coming off here, I can cut that right here, and then that will root if you just leave it in water, and I can start more sweet potato. I just want to give a shout out and a thanks to these 3 homestead workers who basically allow this compost to be made that I can return to the surplus. But I return to you guys too. I take eggs from you, I give you eggshells back, and I give you food back. That's Katie's mama, very, very vocal. And then yesterday's vlog, we basically did the same thing we did up in that bed, is we added compost, we added mulch, and actually already, I don't know if you watched yesterday's vlog, and you look at this one now, look at the difference between the leaves already after a compost application and a little bit of water. It looks so much better. These were kind of furled at the edges, a little bit dried, or looking more like this, but even this stuff's recovering a little bit. And that's just overnight. That's it. It's been just over 12 hours. And that's really already showing signs of improvement. And we know that we're going to be all right when we start getting green bean production right in the garden. All right, guys. That's it for me today. Hope you begin to understand the ethics of permaculture, specifically in this video, the return to the surplus, that third ethic. I'll explore a little bit more into the earth care and people care ethics in different videos, but I really think I covered a decent introduction to all of them today, and tried to really focus on that return to surplus in this video. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, please like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me feel like people are actually watching and feel like people actually like what I'm doing. But it also helps me on YouTube to get a little bit more reach. So if you like it and you have a community that might like it as well, please share to that community. And I'll do my best to keep serving you guys in this community. And I also do want to give a shout out to, I didn't actually get to it today, but hopefully I will tomorrow in another video, to Jimmy and Jeannie. Jimmy right here in Rio Grande, and Jeannie over in Washington. She was a member of Permaculture Woodinville. It was a nonprofit club that I helped found and start in Woodinville. And she's continuing at the helm there while now I'm in Puerto Rico. So thanks, Jeannie, because they actually helped me identify the little red canna lily flower. This one's a wild canna lily, I believe, that actually grows here, but canna lily is also arrowroot, which is potentially edible. So I'm excited to explore that in another video and see if we actually have some sort of harvest that the chickens love the leaves of, that we can actually love the roots of too. So that'll be in a future video. Till next time, have a great day.